very much, Reverend Dr. C.B. Moss. Now, you are in for a treat. Because, you know, when I was in school, and high school, and even my first year or two in college, I didn't like history that much. Because I thought it was boring. But this gentleman that is going to present tonight makes history come alive. And you really get a full appreciation for why it is important and essential to know your history. And what I like about him, he tells it just like it is. He tells the truth about our history. And you know, there are many people who, and he used the term the other night during Dr. Moss's show, these are revisionists. They try to revise the truth to suit their needs. You know, there's an African proverb that says, until the lion writes the story, the victor will always be the hunter. So it's time for us to write our own stories. And I am pleased to tell you that I know that he has written at least one book, is in the process of finishing another book. So we are indeed writing our story as well as keeping it alive through our oral history through Dr. Tracy and the University. I think the University of the Bahamas is doing an incredible job. I think we need to give them a round, and for reasons such as these. Because here is the place where you broaden your horizons and you begin to speak on issues unencumbered and truthfully, so that we will know who we are. The great Frederick Douglass once said, unless you know the lessons of the past, you will continue to repeat the class. And so we're going to be edified and educated this evening, because it gives me tremendous pleasure to present this gentleman. He is very learned. He has an earned PhD, and he is using it very effectively at our University of Bahamas. So please help me to welcome Dr. Christopher Curry, Chair of the Social Sciences and Assistant Professor of History at the University of Bahamas. Dr. Curry.
Thank you so much. Truly a pleasure to be amongst brethren, if I could say it like that, here at the Bahamas Historical Society. I am so happy and excited to share what I plan to prepare and discuss tonight. But before I do that, let me just say a couple of things off record. First of all, I made sure I wore orange tonight so I would stand out. I hope that is effective. And Madam President, my topic for February is as follows: labor, land, and the law, the quest for freedom in the Bahamas. I'll email you later, but just so you know, I have the topic already in my mind. And that's chapter 5, essentially, of my book that came out last year, which is basically looking at the black loyalist struggle for freedom in the Bahamas. It's entitled Freedom and Resistance. I've spent a lot of time this week thinking about and talking about majority rule. I spent this morning at Government High School. I spent Monday at Queen's College, and I spent the time in between on various radio shows and TV shows, including the one that Brother Munnings just mentioned. What I'm going to present tonight is entirely different from what I presented this week. It's the first time I'm presenting this. My topic for tonight is looking at the international dimension to majority rule. You know, a lot of times when we think about majority rule, we sometimes, unfortunately, think about it in a vacuum. We think about majority rule as something that just happened in the Bahamas, as if everything else in the world around the Bahamas did not impact what happened here, or that we likewise didn't impact what was happening over there. I want to argue that majority rule from its inception was always influenced by events outside the Bahamas, as events outside the Bahamas influenced the Bahamas. And I want to draw a long line from Pohnpei to Pimling as well. I am definitely not here to say majority rule began with January 10, 1967 and ended on January 10. I'm definitely not saying it started with 62 and ended in 67. I'm definitely not saying it started in 42 and ended in 67. I want to say, if you want to really talk about majority rule, you must begin with freedom fighters during the period of slavery. And one of the things we know in terms of the international dimension of this topic is that freedom fighters in the Bahamas were always tied to and connected to people around the Black Atlantic, as Paul Gilroy entitled his book. Meaning that black loyalists, for example, that came to the Bahamas, individuals like Amos Williams, Amos Ferguson is, of course, a painter. Amos Williams and Prince Williams and Sambo Scriven, the founders of Bethel Baptist. Indeed, when they came to the Bahamas, they kept writing to their contemporaries in the Baptist world at that time. They were writing to George Lyle in Jamaica. They were writing to Native Baptists back in Savannah, Georgia. And they were writing to people like Ripon in England, who was a leading white Baptist at the time. Their communication is well documented. What is not so well known is that they absolutely had an evangelical impulse that also defined their struggle for freedom. Prince Williams, for one, was a black loyalist who was free because he fought on the side of the British, had a certificate of freedom to prove that he was free, but when he came to the Bahamas, he shows up, sadly, in the Bahamas Gazette as a runaway. And it isn't until around 1800 that he could really declare himself free, and we know that because he shows up in the property documents attached to the lot that is purchased where Bethel Baptist, the building, will be built. And you know that you cannot purchase property if you're a chattel. You had to be a free person in order to what? Buy property. So we know that somehow between 1787 and 1800, he is able to unlock himself and wrestle himself out of that reimposed form of slavery. Remember, he came free, but it was as if he was re-enslaved. And so that is an example of a person who is freedom fighting, engaged in a conflict as such. But he's not the only one. Across the Atlantic world, you have black loyalists and other persons fighting for freedom who communicated their thoughts not just on letter and not just in word, but oftentimes in their praxis. And by praxis, I mean the things that they did. And I find it fascinating when we think about Pompey, for example. We know about the man, but sometimes we don't think enough about his actions. And the fact that he knew somehow, even though he was in isolated Exuma, he knew there was a sympathetic governor in James Carmichael Smith that he could go to and have some kind of a hearing. And that somehow that might lead to his grievances being heard, and that he would not be removed from Exuma to Cat Island, as was the plan. And so he gets in this dinghy. It was actually much bigger than a dinghy. It was a vessel. And he sails with a large group of 30-plus kindred spirit. He lands in Nassau. He's taken up and he's summarily thrown into a workhouse and then eventually sent back to Exuma. But I find it fascinating that he knew where to go. I find it fascinating that he knew who to go to. I find it fascinating that he knew what to do. And so we cannot just dismiss this as just some casual connection. This is intentional. It speaks to a kind of political acumen that enslaved persons, freedom fighters, had. That they knew about freedom. And when you think about the Johnson's estate, again, in Eleuthera, here these individuals had stopped working because they had heard news of impending freedom. Well, where did they hear this news? Sailors, as Gilroy and others, Stuart Hall, have pointed out, that they often transmitted ideas by word of mouth and often did it quite successfully. So I'm suggesting to you that there was a community across the Atlantic world, stretching as far north as Nova Scotia and Boston, where Prince Hall had established the first black lodge, all the way south to the Bahamas and further even to Jamaica and other places. And there was a network of individuals who were thinking and acting and writing and behaving alike. And when slavery is abolished, that doesn't change, because we know in the lodges and in the friendly societies, you had activism in place. These persons were still seeking freedom because, you know, they were given freedom, but they weren't given equality. Right? So what was supposed to be conferred in 1834 was deferred to 1967, so they had to fight for equality and citizenship rights because they were denied it in 1834 when they should have received it. And so in the 19th century, every year you would find lodge members would march up from Bain and Grantstown to the government house, and they would present in a very, very symbolic fashion a set of grievances. This would be a list of things that they actually agitated for, meaning the governor would receive the list and it would have a lot of things on it. And they would present their grievances and they would anticipate that the governor would respond. And in 1888, as Gail Saunders has noted in Post-Emancipation Bahamian Society, they actually took over Trinity Methodist Church. And that was, again, an example of misrule, where just like Junkanoo, blacks would take over Bay Street for a night and call it their own, and of course give it back, so to speak, the next day to the merchant elite. The same thing was happening when they took over Trinity Methodist. They took it over, and then, of course, symbolically it was given back to the whites, because as you may know, Trinity was, at that time, an all-white Methodist congregation. So it was very powerful for the blacks to take it over, even if only for a moment. So these acts, I would like to suggest what we would call proto-political activities. These are labor-driven, they're political activities, but they're not, of course, organized as a formal political party. We know that didn't happen until 1953, but I do not want us for a minute to dismiss these activities. Nor do I want us to lose sight of the fact that all of these activities were not happening in a vacuum in the Bahamas. These lodges were connected to other Masonic groups across the United States, connecting and speaking to people like Prince Hall in Boston and Richard Allen in Philadelphia, always thinking, acting, behaving, and agitating as a group. And as the 20th century turns, we also see the development of Pan-Africanism, which is going to galvanize blacks across the Bahamas and the wider world towards a philosophy and an idea that was absolutely powerful. And you know, Garvey was, of course, a Jamaican, but his impression and his impact was really global. Establishing the Universal Negro Improvement Association in Harlem, New York, and having its headquarters there, Garveyism became one of the most powerful expressions of black nationalism and Pan-Africanism. It had headquarters as far north as Toronto, Canada, and as far south as Argentina. It had chapters in Latin America, the Caribbean, the United States, and Canada. Garvey's reach was impressive. And would you know, Garvey impacted the Quiet Revolution, the March to Majority Rule as well. What we realize now, looking a little deeper into Garveyism, is that his philosophy was really, really powerful. He believed in, of course, race first. And you know, people say that Marcus Garvey was often misunderstood. I believe he was. People think he hated whites. And his response would be, it's not that I hate white people, I just happen to love my own kind. And so, of course, he was a person who preached demonstratively that one should love your own kind first. And that's why it leads me to my second point. Garvey also believed in self-reliance. He believed that black people should own their own businesses, should not have to rely on outsiders, should have an economy that was tailored to their own basic present needs. And he didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. He established the Black Star Line, a shipping company run and owned and operated by blacks. And then thirdly, Garvey also preached black history. Not just black history for the sake of learning names, dates, places, things. He preached history because he understood that the history that they had been taught had been warped by white history. He had people believing and understanding and appreciating the power, the wonder, the majesty of Africa before the incursion of Europeans in the transatlantic slave trade. He taught them about the kingdoms of Songhai, Mali, Ghana, Akon, and many more. So he got them to understand the importance of history. And black Bahamians who went off to the United States on the contract were exposed to two things. They were exposed to a virulent form of racism, expressed through the legal system of Jim Crowism. And people like Clifford Darling and Frederick Toot and others, Sidney Poitier, when they experienced that, it was debilitating and devastating, but they did not allow it to crush them. The reason why is because they were also exposed to Garveyism. Garveyism gave them a tool to agitate for change. Garveyism gave them a kind of consciousness that they did not have here. Garveyism gave them the kind of spirit that allowed them to fight for change when they came back to the Bahamas. And so when these individuals come back to the Bahamas, they were inspired to do something home. And so there is a chapter that is going to be established in the Bahamas, a UNIA chapter on Lewis Street. It was called Liberty House. And in fact, Garvey comes to the Bahamas in November of 1928. The 18th and 19th of November, 1928. Garvey speaks on a program, I just found this out today, in 1928, the Southern Recreational Rounds. He spoke for an hour and a half. I'm not going to speak as long as that. But Garvey spoke for an hour and a half. And what's interesting is on that program, you know who spoke before him? Stephen Dillon, Captain Stephen Dillon. Do you know who followed Garvey, who spoke after him? L.W. Young. And Garvey, on the same day that he spoke, toured Nassau. But when Garvey toured Nassau, he didn't go over to Paradise Island. He didn't go out Cable Beach. He went to Fox Hill, Sandilands, and he toured Grantstown. That tells me that Garvey was interested in the upliftment of his own people. He was interested in making connections with people. And he was interested in getting people to think about what they could do to emancipate themselves from the colonial system that was oppressing them. Garveyism, I believe, has not been researched adequately. I'm just giving you a little touch or tip of the iceberg. I believe this is an area of rich scholarship that I'm just waiting for a student to explore. The connection between Garveyism and what was happening in the 20s and 30s in the Caribbean, and what happens in the Bahamas in the 40s and 50s with the formation of the Citizens Committee and later the PLP. And speaking about the Citizens Committee, which was formed in 1950, it was a precursor to the Progressive Liberal Party. And the Citizens Committee demanded that the ban that was placed on No Way Out be lifted. And it was a ban that was placed in a film that privileged a great Bahamian actor from Cat Island, a man who was portraying a black doctor with white subordinates. How controversial, how provocative. And of course, you're going to appreciate why the Bay Street Boys didn't want that film shown at the Savoy, right? Right? It would totally turn everyone's head upside down to see that kind of portrayal, powerful as it was. And of course, they were successful. How and why were they successful in getting the ban lifted? The Citizens Committee drew upon the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we are celebrating the 70th anniversary of it. And of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed in 1948. Citizens Committee, 2 years later, are drawing on that document to advance the case that there are inalienable human rights that black people should have. We are not objects, we are subjects, we are human beings, and you cannot deny us basic rights. And so beyond just advancing the revolution of that film, they also advanced that blacks should be included in advertisement, the Tourism Development Board. They wrote letters to staff at SANS. They wrote letters about the health conditions in over the hill areas. They advanced a lot of different things beyond just revoking that ban on the film. And they drew upon international language in advancing their case. Beyond that, when we look at the women's suffrage movement, we also see that the women's suffrage movement, the suffragettes, also built on an international tradition in law and precedent established both in the United States and Great Britain, where women's suffrage movement had led to universal suffrage. And so they looked at the movements abroad, and they found ways to tailor the language and the rhetoric to their own context here in the Bahamas. When Doris Johnson spoke in Maxwell Thompson's court, do you know that she actually harkened back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? But she also spoke to the United States Declaration of Independence, those inalienable rights that had been afforded to white men in the 18th century. She spoke to those rights now being absolutely and inherently part of a struggle for freedom that women were now engaged in. And so what we're seeing is that activists in the Bahamas, whether it be through Garvey's nationalist rhetoric, or whether it be the UDHR, or whether it be the suffrage movement abroad in the US and Caribbean, these movements impacted and influenced those who are struggling and fighting for freedom right here in the Bahamas. And as we move closer to 67, I share a couple more salient anecdotal notes, and I think this is connected really to labor. In April of 1956, there was a lecture held at Western Senior. It was organized by the Bahamas Federation of Labor, and invited to speak at that event were two men from the NAACP. They were both doctors. It was Edward Brown and Dr. James Allen. And they spoke about the need for labor to rise up and fight the legal encumbrances that were keeping blacks subjugated here in the Bahamas. They used the legal system as a tool for change, and they were encouraging black Bahamians to do likewise. This was a lecture that was organized by the Bahamas Federation of Labor, and it was a very powerful lecture. I give you another anecdote. In December 15, 1958, Martin Luther King wrote a letter to Sir Randall Fawkes. I found this letter on the lovely and amazing, powerful website that Rosalie Fawkes and the Fawkes family has put up, so that we have a PDF file essentially of that wonderful book, and lots of manuscript documents. You could spend hours on that web, but I digress. In the letter, Martin Luther King wrote the following. He wrote a letter and he said he personally appreciated Randall Fawkes for his determined courage and dedication to the cause of freedom and human dignity. Let us break that down a little bit. What I want to say is, note, it is Martin Luther King who is writing to Fawkes. Note that he is the one that is esteeming, that is praising, that is complimenting the work of his contemporary. This is not Sir Randall writing Martin Luther King. He actually had already done that earlier. Look at what he is praising Sir Randall for. His dedication and determination to two things: to freedom and human dignity. What this document tells me is it wasn't like the Bahamas and our quiet revolutionary freedom fighters were drawing inspiration from the United States. I want to argue that this document supports the view that there was a symbiotic relationship between the two movements, that we drew inspiration from them, but guess what? They also drew inspiration from us. Let's get away from the notion that we somehow borrowed their ideas and just implemented it in here. No. Maybe it's possible to think the other way around, that maybe Martin Luther King, coming to the Bahamas, drew inspiration from the BFL leader, Sir Randall Fawkes. Symbiotic, mutually beneficial, inspiring activism. We must begin to think about majority rule within an international context in which the Bahamas was a beacon of hope and light to the rest of the world, as much as it also drew inspiration from those other places of light and enlightenment. Let me end by saying that majority rule, no doubt, is a milestone in Bahamian history. Milestone in the sense that it is not an end point, nor is it a beginning point, obviously. It is a milestone in the sense that it represents the flowering of democracy. It represents the ideals that we are still aspiring to. They are aspirational goals embedded in 67. For example, we know that one of the pillars of democracy is rights. And one of the rights that we know is established in 67 is the right to an education. Education before 67 was a privilege. Education after 67 is a right. Every child in the Bahamas from age 6 to 14, and it's later extended, is guaranteed access to education in the Bahamas. More than that, 67 says to me, where I used to be judged based on the color of my skin, now I am being judged based on the content of my character. That is an aspirational goal embedded in 67. And finally, 67 allows the flourishing of nationalist institutions catering to Bahamians. We have the establishment of a mortgage corporation. We have the establishment of a college by 1974. We have the establishment of a national insurance board. We have the establishment of a defense force by 1979. So, majority rule affords for the expression and expansion of rights, for nationalism to be expounded upon and established concretely with independence. So I'm saying to you, there is much for us to still do. Democracy can still be expanded. Gender equality still needs to be achieved. Equality in the workplace still needs to be worked out. Labor issues are still at the fore. But as we celebrate the 60th anniversary of the general strike this January, and as we celebrate the 51st anniversary of majority rule, and as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the general election of 1968, and as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's death, and as we celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, let us never forget our freedom fighters who fought so valiantly forward, upward, onward, together. Thank you.